The birch tree outside my kitchen window had dropped most of its leaves by the second week of October. I noticed that the morning after my daughter-in-law called to ask whether I had sent the check. Not "Good morning," not "How are you feeling, Raymond?" Just, "Did you send the check?" I told her I had transferred the amount the previous Friday. She said the funds had not appeared in the account yet and that the contractor was threatening to walk. I told her to have the contractor call me directly. She said that was not necessary, that she would handle it, and that I should follow up with my bank. Then she ended the call. I set my phone down on the counter and stood there, looking out at the birch tree for a while. 64 years old, retired 6 months, and still learning what it feels like to be managed by someone who has decided you are more useful as a source of funds than as a person. The check was not actually for a check. It was the fourth electronic transfer I had made to my son Marcus's restaurant since the previous January. The total, at that point, was $270,000. Every dollar of it had come from the retirement account my wife Helen and I had spent 28 years building before she died of a cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in March. 3 years ago, she had been 59. I had held her hand in the hospital and promised her, among other things, that I would not disappear into grief, that I would stay useful, that I would find ways to put what we had built to good use. Marcus had given me that purpose. He had come to me 18 months after his mother's death with a business plan for a restaurant he wanted to open in the West End of Toronto, a farm-to-table concept he called Stonefield. He had worked in restaurant kitchens since he was 23, trained under 2 well-regarded chefs in Vancouver, spent a year staging in Lyon. He knew the industry. He knew the craft. What he needed was capital, and what I had was capital. And for a grieving father with an empty house in Mississauga and a retirement account that had been meant for 2 people's futures, the arrangement had felt like something close to a reason. We had not signed a formal agreement. I had drafted one, a simple 2-page document outlining my contribution, the terms of any repayment, and my right to be kept informed of major business decisions. Marcus had read it at my kitchen table and looked up with an expression I recognized from when he was 14, and I had asked him to account for a failing mark. Not anger, disappointment. "Dad, it's a restaurant, not a corporation." I put the document away. I told myself he was right. I told myself that trust was the currency between a father and a son, and that demanding paper proof of it was a kind of poverty I did not want to practice. I understand now what that decision cost me. For the first 8 months, Marcus called every week. He was generous with details, which I had always loved about him as a boy. He would describe the renovation progress in the kind of granular specificity that made me feel present in a space I had never set foot in. The reclaimed wood for the bar top, the negotiation with the lighting supplier, the argument with the permit office over the kitchen ventilation system. I felt like a partner. I felt, for the first time since Helen died, that I was building something again. Then Diane became the restaurant's general manager. Diane was Marcus's wife of 4 years. She had a degree in hospitality management and had worked front of house at 2 downtown restaurants before Stonefield. She was sharp and she was thorough, and she had, from the beginning, a way of speaking to me that was cordial in the way that certain kinds of dismissal can be cordial. Professional, arm's length. Her emails were always prompt and always just formal enough to signal that she considered our relationship administrative rather than familial. When Diane took over the finances, the weekly calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. Then I was receiving forwarded invoices and the occasional brief email update that felt less like communication and more like the minimum required to keep me from asking questions. I told myself this was how businesses operated, that Marcus was busy, that a son building something real did not have time for the same long phone calls as a son who was only dreaming about it. I found other things to occupy my days. I took up woodworking in the garage. I joined a walking group through the Mississauga Rec Center. I drove out to visit my sister in Guelph more often, but I kept the records. 32 years as a civil engineer had given me an almost involuntary habit of documentation. Every transfer, every forwarded invoice, every email exchange went into a folder on my desktop. Not because I expected to need it, because it was the way I was built. The call in October, the one about the check, was the 4th time in 2 months that Diane had called me about money. Each call had been efficient and transactional. There had been no call about the soft opening, I had not known there was a soft opening until I mentioned to Marcus in a text that I was thinking of driving into the city the following weekend and asking if there was anything worth seeing at Stonefield. He responded 4 hours later with a single line. The soft opening was actually a few weeks ago. Things have been hectic. We'll have you over soon. A few weeks ago. I sat with my phone on my knee in my living room in Mississauga, with the television off and the house very quiet, and I read that message several times. I thought about the $270,000. I thought about the draft agreement I had put away in a drawer. I thought about Helen, and what she would have said, and I thought she would have said, "Raymond, ask the question." I called Marcus the following morning. He answered, which surprised me. He sounded distracted in the way of someone standing in a commercial kitchen during prep. "Marcus, when did Stonefield open?" A pause. We did a quiet opening about 3 weeks back. Just industry people, some close friends. We wanted to keep the pressure low for the first run. I understood that. I had read enough about restaurant openings to know that a soft launch, without the glare of full public attention, was a reasonable strategy. What I was trying to understand was something else entirely. Was I not invited? The pause this time was longer. "Dad, it was really just professional contacts. Chef people. You would have been bored. I had contributed $270,000 to the restaurant my son had just opened. I had not been invited. I had been told, as a secondary matter in a text message, that it had already happened. I told Marcus I would like to visit the following week. He said that would be fine. I told him I would like Diane to be present as well. Another pause. I'll mention it to her. "Please do," I said. I spent the week between that call and the visit, doing what I had done as an engineer for 3 decades, when I suspected a structure was not as sound as the drawing suggested. I went back to the original documents. I spread everything I had across the dining room table. Every email, every forwarded invoice, every transfer confirmation. I made a timeline on a large piece of paper the way I used to make timelines for project phases, and I began to match the funds I had transferred against the expenses I had been told they were covering. The numbers did not reconcile. I am not an accountant, but an engineer who has spent a career managing project budgets, knows how to read a discrepancy. There were invoices for equipment that did not match the amounts I had been told the equipment cost. There was a recurring expense listed as marketing and brand development that I had approved in a general sense, in a forwarded email where Diane had mentioned they would be bringing in outside support for the restaurant's launch, without ever being told what that support would cost on a monthly basis or who was providing it. The amount, when I added the recurring charges across the months since Diane had taken over the finances, was $31,400. Paid to a numbered company, a company I had never heard of. I called my neighbor Frank over for coffee. Frank had spent his career in finance, and though he was now fully retired and primarily concerned with his vegetable garden, he still had the instincts of someone who had spent decades following money. I showed him what I had laid out. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, refilling his coffee once without asking. "Do you know who registered that numbered company?" he said finally. I told him I did not. He looked at me over his mug. "You should find that out before your visit." I hired a paralegal, a woman named Soraya, who worked out of a small office in Port Credit and came highly recommended by Frank. I gave her the company number and 3 days. She came back to me on a Thursday evening with a registration document and a name. The numbered company had been registered 18 months earlier. The registered director was Diane's sister, a woman named Keiko, who listed her occupation on the registration as a consultant. I had met Keiko twice, once at Marcus and Diane's wedding, and once at a Christmas dinner 4 years ago. She was pleasant and quiet. I had no knowledge of what she consulted in or for whom. $31,400 to a company run by my daughter-in-law's sister. I did not call Marcus when I found this out. I went for a long walk along the Credit River Trail instead, the one I had been walking since Marcus was a boy, and I used to bring him to look for crayfish under the stones. The river was low for October, running clear over the flat limestone shelf near the second bridge. I stood on that bridge for a while, watching the water move, and thinking about what Helen would have said. She would have said, "Go to the meeting and say what you know, not what you suspect, what you know." The visit to Stonefield was on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. The restaurant was closed between lunch and dinner service, which meant the dining room was quiet when I arrived. Marcus met me at the door. He looked well but tired in the particular way that new business owners look tired. The restaurant itself was beautiful. I want to say that clearly because it was. Warm brick walls, those reclaimed wood bar tops Marcus had described to me over the phone 18 months ago. Linen napkins folded on every table, a small, open kitchen visible through a pass-through where a young cook was doing prep work with careful, practiced movements. Marcus had built something real. I felt proud of him in the same breath as I felt everything else. Diane was already seated at one of the tables near the window. She stood when I came in, and there was nothing in her expression I could read clearly. Professional composure, the kind I had come to associate with her. We sat. A server brought water and coffee without being asked. Marcus sat between us, which I noticed. I placed 3 things on the table: the timeline I had prepared, a summary of the invoices I had cross-referenced, and the registration document for the numbered company, with Keiko's name highlighted. I did not make a speech. I had learned long ago that speeches lose arguments. I said, I'd like to understand these 3 things. The difference between what I transferred and what the invoices account for, the marketing and brand development charges to this company, and who Keiko is in relation to this work. What followed was an hour and 40 minutes that I will not describe completely, because there were things said in that room that belonged to Marcus and Diane's marriage, and not to me. And whatever my grievances, I am not in the business of pulling apart what my son has built with his wife. What I will say is this. Diane said the payments to Keiko's company were for legitimate brand strategy and social media development. She said she had informed Marcus in general terms. Marcus said he had understood there was a marketing consultant, but had not known it was Keiko's company or what the monthly cost was. Diane said Marcus had approved the arrangement. Marcus said he had approved marketing support in principle, but not the specific structure. I watched my son's face while they spoke. I have known Marcus for 36 years, since before he could talk, since before he had a name. I know the look he gets when he realizes something he should have known sooner. I saw it that afternoon. It was the look of a man understanding that he had trusted completely in a place where he should have looked more closely. I did not say anything about that look. It was not mine to say. When there was a pause long enough, I said, I need 2 things. A complete accounting of all expenditures against my investment from the first transfer to today, and a formal written acknowledgement of the $31,400, along with a plan to address it. Diane said she would need to speak with her accountant. I said I had expected that and that I would give them 3 weeks. I asked for confirmation by email that they had received this request. Diane sent it while I was still at the table, which told me she was prepared for this conversation in ways that Marcus perhaps was not. At the door, Marcus walked me to my car. The afternoon had gone gray, and there was the smell of rain coming in off the lake. He stood beside my car with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the street. I didn't know about Keiko, he said. I looked at him. I believe you. I should have been paying more attention. Yes, I said. You should have. But that is something you can fix. What I needed you to hear today is that I am not going anywhere. I am not withdrawing. I am not threatening anything. But I needed you to know what I know. And I needed you to know that I expect to be treated as a partner, not as a line item. He nodded. He looked, for a moment, very much like the 14-year-old who used to sit across from me at this same dining room table working through calculus problems, uncertain but not defeated. I drove back to Mississauga on the lakeshore, the long way, the way I used to drive before the expressways became the default. The lake was flat and gray on my left. I had the radio on low. 3 weeks later, I received a package by courier. It contained a 12-page financial accounting of every dollar spent against my investment, prepared by Diane's accountant and reviewed, apparently, by a second accountant Marcus had retained independently. The $31,400 to Keiko's company was itemized line by line. Attached was a signed letter from both Marcus and Diane, acknowledging the expenditure and proposing a repayment of the full amount over 14 months from the restaurant's operating revenue, beginning the first of the following month. There was also a second document. It was the formal investment agreement I had drafted and put away in a drawer 18 months ago. Marcus had retrieved it, apparently, from the copy I had sent him by email at the time. He had signed it. Diane had signed it. A notary had witnessed both signatures. I called Frank to tell him. He said, good. I called Soraya to let her know her work was done. She said she was glad it had gone that way. I did not call Marcus immediately. I waited until Sunday morning, our old habit from his childhood, when I used to call him at university every Sunday after breakfast. He answered on the second ring. "I received the package," I said. "I know," he said. "I should have asked you to sign that agreement at the beginning. I thought it would feel like I didn't trust you." I sat with that for a moment. I told him something I had been thinking about since the meeting at Stonefield. I said, "Marcus, a written agreement is not about trust. It is about respect. It says I take this seriously enough to put it in writing. It says I believe in this enough to make it real. It protects both of us. It protects you as much as it protects me." There was a quiet on the line that felt different from discomfort. It felt like thinking. "Yeah," he said. "I understand that now." The months that followed were not a return to the way things had been before, because they could not be. Something had been named that had previously gone unnamed, and once a thing is named, it changes the shape of every conversation around it. But the shape that emerged was, I think, more honest than what had existed before. Marcus and I spoke every Sunday again. The calls were not as long as the early ones, but they were more direct. He told me about the restaurant's challenges, without waiting until they had resolved themselves. He asked my opinion on decisions before making them. Not always, not about everything, but on the things that mattered. Diane and I developed an understanding that I would describe as respectful, if not warm. She sent the monthly repayment on the first of each month, along with a brief financial summary of the restaurant's performance. I read every one. I responded to each with a brief acknowledgement. We did not become close. I did not need us to become close. What I needed was honesty, and that she provided. I was not at the soft opening of Stonefield. I was not in the room when my son's restaurant first served its first table of guests. I will not pretend that did not cost me something. I had imagined being there, had imagined standing at the back of the room watching the kitchen fire up, watching Marcus move through the dining room with the particular ease of a person operating in a space they have built exactly as they imagined it. I had imagined calling Helen afterward, and then remembered I could not, and imagined telling her anyway, in the way I had learned to tell her things. That did not happen. What happened instead was this. On a Saturday evening in late February, Marcus called and asked if I would like to come for dinner the following weekend. Not a special occasion, he said. Just dinner. He said he would have the kitchen make whatever I wanted, and that I could sit at the chef's counter and watch the service, if I felt like it. I felt like it. I sat on a stool at the end of the pass-through counter on a Saturday in early March and watched my son's kitchen work through a full dinner service. 82 covers. Every plate that went out through that pass-through, Marcus touched. He called the tickets in a low, steady voice. He tasted. He adjusted. He sent a plate back once and remade it himself, without any visible frustration. He was, I understood watching him, exceptionally good at this. Not just capable. Good in the way that only years of work in the right direction produce. At the end of service, he came and sat on the stool beside me with 2 glasses of wine and the last of a bread service that had not made it to a table. He said, "What do you think?" I looked around the room. The last guests were finishing. The servers were resetting quietly. Through the pass-through, the kitchen crew was beginning the end-of-service breakdown with the focused efficiency of people who had done this many times. "I think your mother would have loved this place," I said. Marcus did not say anything. He looked at his wine glass for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I thought about her a lot when we were building it." We finished the wine without talking much. Sometimes that is the right amount of words. I am 64 years old. I spent 32 years as an engineer, and I understand better than most that every structure is only as sound as its foundation, and that the time to inspect the foundation is before you begin to build, not after the walls have gone up. I did not do that here. I believed that love was a sufficient foundation, and I was wrong. Not about the love, but about the sufficiency. Love without honesty is not a foundation. It is a wish. What I would say to any parent in the position I found myself in is this. When you invest in a child's dream, you are not purchasing a guarantee. You are extending trust. And trust, to remain healthy, requires the same maintenance that any other structure requires. Regular inspection, clear language, a shared understanding of what the terms are. A contract between a parent and a child is not a sign that you doubt each other. It is a sign that you respect each other enough to be clear. It says, what we are building together matters enough to do properly. It says, "I believe in you and in this, and I want that belief to stand on something real." The repayment from Marcus and Diane was completed 7 months ahead of schedule. Marcus called to tell me the final transfer had gone through. I told him to put the remainder toward a piece of equipment the kitchen needed, something I had heard him mention wanting. He said he could not do that. I told him that was not a request. Stonefield is doing well now. It was reviewed in 2 national publications this past spring, and both reviewers said what I already knew, that the food was careful and honest, and made by someone who understood that the best cooking was not about complexity, but about respect for the ingredient. I visit on the last Sunday of every month. Marcus meets me at the chef's counter before service begins, and we go over whatever is on his mind, the way we used to go over his homework at the kitchen table in Mississauga 25 years ago. He asks questions. I answer what I can and tell him when I cannot. It is not the relationship I thought I was building when I signed over the first transfer. It is something better. It is a relationship we chose, both of us, after understanding what the alternative was. If you are a parent who is given to a child, given money, given time, given belief, and you have found yourself being treated as a resource rather than a person, I want to say something clearly and without softness. Your instinct to stay quiet, to avoid the difficult conversation, to protect the relationship by not straining it, is understandable. I know it because I lived it, but silence is not protection. Silence is a slow accumulation of unspoken things that will eventually become a weight no relationship can carry. Ask the question. Request the document. Sit at the table and say what you know. Do it without anger and without ultimatum, but do it with clarity, and do not apologize for the clarity. A child who loves you will sit across that table and work through it. A child who cannot do that is telling you something about the work that still needs to happen between you, and that is information you need, even if it is hard to receive. You are not a bank. You are a parent. And the difference between those two things is worth every difficult conversation it takes to make it clear.